Among the dooziest subjects of inquiry was Hurricane Katrina. Not just a natural disaster, but a cataclysm. 1,800 Americans killed, a great American city in many ways lost, and a presidential administration infamously flat-footed, if not criminally negligent, in its response. But when the topic of Hurricane Katrina came up during his farewell press conference today, President Bush still had his eye on the wrong ball.
I thought long and hard about Katrina. You know, could I have done something differently? Like land Air Force One, either New Orleans or Baton Rouge. The problem with that is that law enforcement would have been pulled away from the mission, and then your questions, I suspect, would have been, how could you possibly have flown Air Force One into Baton Rouge and police officers that were needed to expedite traffic out of New Orleans were taken off the task to look after you?
Think about this for a second. President Bush thought long and hard about Katrina, and what he came up with was, maybe I could have done the photo op differently. Actually, on second thought, I nailed that photo op. Wow. Not surprisingly, there were a number of follow-up questions after that gobsmacking answer. When asked what more needs to be done in New Orleans, the president used the opportunity to vehemently defend his government's response to the hurricane.
You know, people said, but the federal response was slow. Don't tell me the federal response was slow when there was 30,000 people pulled off roofs right after the storm passed. 30,000 people were pulled off roofs right after the storm moved through. It's a pretty quick response. Could things have been done better? Absolutely. Absolutely. But when I hear people say the federal response was slow, then what are they going to say to those chopper drivers or the 30,000 that got pulled off the roofs?
The problem for President Bush here is that his legacy on this is our legacy on this as Americans, and it's New Orleans' legacy up close. We know what happened. It was well documented, mostly on tape. And the federal response to Katrina encompassed a heck of a lot more than the helicopter rescues. For the record, National Guard troops did not arrive in the area until 2 days after the levees were breached. FEMA did not finalize its request for buses to move people out of the affected area until 6 days after Katrina hit. FEMA trucks loaded up with ice were rerouted to Georgia and South Carolina and Maine. Maine? Yes, Maine. And it isn't as if we didn't all have warning. This was the language that the National Weather Service used that Sunday, which was the day before Katrina hit. Quote, most of the area will be uninhabitable for weeks, perhaps longer. At least one half of well-constructed homes will have roof and wall failure. Power outages will last for weeks. Water shortages will make human suffering incredible by modern standards. Armed with that dire warning, here's what our leaders in the federal government were up to. As a historical reminder, Katrina made landfall on Monday, August 29th. That day, President Bush spent the morning eating birthday cake with Senator McCain in Arizona. If you look at the official White House photo album for August 29th, 2005, this is what you see. The next day, on Tuesday, as reports came in of looting in New Orleans and thousands of people trapped in the Superdome at the convention center, President Bush traveled to Southern California and was photographed playing a guitar with country music singer Mark Wills. On Wednesday, when things were getting really, really, really bad, FEMA seemed more concerned about how much time Michael Brown had to eat dinner than whether food and water were getting to those people who were stranded in New Orleans. Quoting the Associated Press, a FEMA official emailed Brown to tell him that thousands of evacuees were gathering in the streets with no food or water, and that estimates are many will die within hours. A short time later, Brown's press secretary, Sharon Worthy, wrote colleagues to complain that the FEMA director needed more time to eat dinner at a Baton Rouge restaurant that evening. Quote, he needs much more than 20 or 30 minutes. President Bush's speech in Jackson Square 2.5 weeks later, a speech that had to be lit with floodlights since much of New Orleans was still without power.
As all of us saw on television, there's also some deep, persistent poverty in this region as well. That poverty has roots in a history of racial discrimination, which cut off generations from the opportunity of America. We have a duty to confront this poverty with bold action.
Remember, in the wake of Katrina, President Bush's bold action to turn the nation's attention to confronting poverty? Remember that? Joining us now is Jed Horne. He is the author of the book Breach of Faith, Hurricane Katrina and the Near Death of a Great American City. He was city editor of the New Orleans Times-Picayune newspaper when Katrina hit. Mr. Horne, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, my pleasure, Rachel.
What is your reaction when you hear President Bush say that the federal response to Katrina was not slow?
Well, I think if you're looking to rewrite history, you ought to attend to more than the photo ops. I mean, it really is astonishing, I think, to us here in New Orleans to hear this kind of chatter when, in fact, the situation was so much more dire than any trip to Baton Rouge or New Orleans by Air Force One could possibly have remedied. And in reference to the Coast Guard, no one here disputes that the Coast Guard did spectacular work. It remains to wonder then why, given their performance, the rest of the federal apparatus was so slow, so retarded. Why days later Mike Chertoff still evidently didn't know that there were levee breaches in New Orleans, that there were people seething and in fact dying in front of the convention center. Why it was that they evidently didn't know that the storm could be lethal to 60,000 people, or claimed not to know that, when in fact tapes released later on showed Bush getting the update on Sunday in Crawford, in which those kinds of casualty numbers were very much part of the conversation.
There is, as you say, broad agreement that the Coast Guard performed courageously in the wake of the storm. With the research that you did and what you experienced during Katrina, in your estimation, if you could pick a lesson for the federal government to have learned from Katrina, the worst thing that they needed to make sure to never do again, what would you have had them learn?
Well, I think they need to learn, above all, to give federal agencies some leeway, some autonomy to function efficiently and expeditiously. What happened almost immediately, and this was, you know, as the blowback to Bush became deeply embarrassing to the administration, everything became political. And thereafter, for 3 years to this day, a very toxic kind of partisanship has shaped the federal involvement in the Katrina mess, and it remains a mess to this day. It was, you know, particularly unfortunate to see squabbling late in that first week over whether Bush could get Governor Blanco to capitulate and somehow throw the state National Guard into the arms of the federal armies that were still not reaching New Orleans at that time, as though this would reveal her own shortcomings and in that way shift blame from the Bush administration. And it just went on from there. Efforts to draw invidious comparisons between Blanco and the good Republican Haley Barbour over in Mississippi. Proportionally huge amounts more of money heaped on Mississippi per capita than on Louisiana, despite the far greater need, of course, in Louisiana, the far greater devastation here.
Mr. Horne, President Bush gave that speech in Jackson Square about 2.5 weeks after the hurricane hit, pledging famously that he was going to start working on poverty. He was going to start working on the legacies of racial discrimination. This far out from Hurricane Katrina, the residents of New Orleans are still living in a city that is dramatically changed by, dramatically hurt by that storm. Is there any sense that he has kept any of the promises that he made in that speech, any of the post-storm promises?
Well, there have been things done down here. Make no mistake about that. The housing projects were reduced to rubble at a time when many people thought we probably needed to save them for a time in order to have low-income housing available to the workforce that was, at that point, unable to return to the city. Work has begun on the levee system. 2 years after the storm, we finally got, and there have been endless studies and all sorts of drum roll, we finally were told what the Bush commitment would be to flood defense. And the astonishing thing, really, from the perspective of New Orleans, was that the commitment was to protect the city from a 100-year storm. Now, that sounds good. You know, you figure one storm in a century. In fact, a 100-year storm is a term of art. There is a 1% chance of a 100-year storm happening in any given year, or perhaps 2 or 3 times a year, as happened in 2005 when Rita followed Katrina. In fact, a 100-year flood defense is not enough to have protected the city from Katrina. Katrina was a 300-year storm 3 times the strength of the storm that now, somewhat grudgingly, the federal government has agreed to shore us up against. The Dutch and people like that who take flood defense really quite seriously are flabbergasted by this sort of feckless, lackadaisical response. The Dutch had their Katrina in '53. They have fortified their coast against weather events that can be expected once in 10,000 years. That's a flood defense 100 times as strong as the one that the Bush people, and it's still unfunded,